The evening air was colder than usual in Chicago. One of those nights when the wind cut straight through your coat and the city lights felt a little lonelier than usual. At the edge of a quiet street near Lincoln Park, a small boy, no more than 8, sat on a bench, swinging his legs and clutching a worn blue jacket too big for him. It was missing a button, the fabric frayed at the cuffs, but it was his favorite. His mother had told him it once belonged to someone special, though she never said who. People hurried past. Office workers, joggers, couples on their phones. Each one wrapped in their own world. The boy didn't seem to notice them. He was watching an older man sitting a few benches away, shivering in a thin shirt despite the dropping temperature. The man's hands trembled as he tried to warm them with his breath. He had that look, the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones, not your muscles. The boy hesitated, biting his lip. Then he stood, walked over, and held out his jacket. "You can have this," he said simply. The man looked up, startled. "What? You look cold," the boy said, smiling shyly. "My mom says we're supposed to help people when we can." The man blinked, caught between gratitude and disbelief. "But it's freezing. You'll need it." The boy shook his head. "I'm okay. Mom's coming soon. She'll have her car heater on." Something about the boy's voice, gentle, sure, and far too kind for his age, made the man's chest tighten. He took the jacket slowly, the fabric warm from the boy's body. "Thank you," he whispered. "You didn't have to." The boy shrugged. "Mom says everyone needs a little warmth sometimes." Then, before the man could say more, a car horn honked down the street. The boy turned, waved, and ran toward the silver sedan that had just pulled up. As he opened the door, the interior light flicked on, and for a brief second, the man saw the driver's face. Stopped him cold. The woman in the car, her hair tied back, her eyes tired but kind, was someone he'd once loved more than life itself, someone he hadn't seen in almost 9 years. "Claire," he whispered, the name barely escaping his lips. And then they were gone, the car vanishing into the evening traffic, leaving him sitting there in the cold, wrapped in a blue jacket that felt like a heartbeat he'd lost long ago. The man stared down at the jacket, hands trembling, and turned over the inner tag. Faded letters were stitched along the seam, a name he knew all too well. Ethan Cross, his own. He froze. That jacket wasn't the boy's at all. It was his, the one he'd left behind the night he walked away from the family he thought he didn't deserve. And now, somehow, it had found its way back to him, through the hands of a child he didn't know. Or maybe, he thought as his throat tightened, a child he did. The name on the jacket echoed in his mind like a ghost he couldn't silence. Ethan Cross. It had been almost a decade since he'd last heard it spoken aloud. 9 years since he'd walked out of that house believing he was doing the right thing. But life had a cruel way of circling back, and tonight, under the amber glow of a Chicago street lamp, fate had come full circle in the form of a boy with his eyes. He pulled the blue jacket tighter around him, feeling the faint warmth that lingered from the child's small frame. The fabric smelled faintly of laundry soap and something else. Vanilla and lavender, the same scent his ex, Claire, used to keep on her clothes. His throat tightened as memories began to surface. Not all at once, but in flashes. A small apartment filled with laughter. A crib by the window. Claire humming quietly while he worked late at the kitchen table. And then the shouting, the slammed doors. The night he left without looking back. He had convinced himself that walking away was mercy, that his mistakes, the debt, the broken promises, the lies would only poison them both. He thought he was giving them a better life by disappearing. But now, as he sat there in the cold, clutching a jacket that shouldn't exist anymore, all he could feel was regret. He whispered the name to himself again, testing it, like a wound he'd never let heal. Ethan Cross. For years, he'd gone by another name, working quiet jobs, keeping to the shadows, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. But now it seemed life had found him anyway. He stood, scanning the street. The car was long gone, swallowed by traffic. But he couldn't shake the image of the boy. His small smile, his gentle voice, his courage. There was something achingly familiar about the way he spoke, the way his nose wrinkled when he smiled. Ethan's heart pounded. Could that be my son? The thought nearly knocked the breath out of him. He had left when the boy was just an infant, too young to remember his face, too innocent to understand why his father never came home. But now, almost 9 years later, that same child had unknowingly given him warmth. The one thing Ethan had been running from, kindness. He couldn't let it end there. Not again. The next morning, before dawn, he made his way back to the same street. The bench was still there, glistening with dew. The sun was barely breaking through the fog when he noticed something. A small, crumpled drawing caught between the bench slats. He pulled it free and smoothed it out. It was drawn in crayon. A stick-figure man, a woman with long hair, and a little boy standing between them. At the top, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Me, Mom, and Daddy." Ethan's breath caught. The figure of the man had a blue jacket drawn on. His hands trembled as he folded the paper, tucking it gently into the pocket of that same jacket. He knew what he had to do now. Find them. Not just to return the coat, but to face the truth he'd spent years running from. For the first time in almost a decade, Ethan walked toward the train station with a purpose. He didn't know where they lived, but he remembered the old neighborhood, the quiet corner near Belmont where Claire's mother used to stay. Maybe she'd gone back there. Maybe fate was giving him one last chance to fix what he'd broken. As the morning trains roared past, Ethan gripped the drawing like a compass pointing him home. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He was walking straight into it. The city was still waking up when Ethan reached Belmont Street, that narrow stretch of old brick houses, quiet bakeries, and parked cars glistening under the early sun. It had been nearly 10 years, but the place hadn't changed much. The same corner grocery store still displayed apples out front. The same church bell chimed at 8 a.m., and the same cracked sidewalk wound its way past Claire's old building. He stood across the street, staring at it. The faded green door, the chipped paint on the windowsill, the small flower pot that always sat outside. Back then, he'd helped her plant those flowers himself. "They'll survive anything," she'd said with that stubborn smile. "Even you." Now the pot was still there, but the flowers were gone. Just soil and roots, dry and forgotten. Ethan's chest tightened. He walked closer, every step heavier than the last. The last time he'd stood in front of that door, it was night, and he'd been too much of a coward to knock. Instead, he'd left his jacket, this jacket, on the porch, thinking it was better to leave something warm behind than nothing at all. Now it had found its way back to him through a child. He knocked softly. No answer. He tried again, harder this time. After a few moments, the door opened. Not by Claire, but by an older woman in a robe and reading glasses. She blinked. "Can I help you?" "Hi, Mrs. Bennett," Ethan said quietly. His voice cracked slightly as he said the name. "It's me, Ethan." The woman froze, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "Ethan Cross," she whispered. He nodded. For a moment, she just stared at him. Disbelief, anger, and maybe something like pity flashing across her face. "You've got nerve coming back here after all this time." "I know," he said softly, "but I'm not here to make excuses. I just need to know. Claire, is she here?" Mrs. Bennett sighed heavily. "She moved out years ago, works 2 jobs now, raising her boy on her own. You'd know that if you hadn't disappeared." Ethan lowered his head. I deserve that. Her tone softened, though her eyes stayed sharp. What do you want, Ethan? He hesitated, then pulled the folded drawing from his pocket and handed it to her. I met him. She frowned, unfolding the paper. When she saw the drawing, her eyes widened slightly. You saw Ben. Ethan's heart stopped. Ben. So that was his name. Yeah, he said quietly. He was sitting near Lincoln Park last night. I didn't know who he was until later. He gave me this jacket, said his mom taught him to help people. I recognized your daughter when she came to pick him up. Mrs. Bennett's eyes softened, her voice lowering. He gave you the jacket? He nodded. It's mine. The one I left years ago. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped back, motioning him inside. Wait here. Ethan entered slowly. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old memories. The same family photos still hung on the wall. Claire as a teenager, her college graduation, her holding a newborn in her arms. He stopped at that one. Then, he couldn't stop looking at the baby's tiny hand gripping her finger. When Mrs. Bennett returned, she was holding a small envelope. She left this here a few years ago. Said if you ever came back, I should give it to you. Ethan's hands trembled as he took it. The envelope was yellowed with age, the writing on the front still in her neat handwriting. For Ethan, if you ever remember us. He sat down slowly, his heart pounding. Inside was a short letter. You said you were leaving to protect us. Maybe you believed that. But protection without presence isn't love. Ethan. Ben deserves more than a ghost for a father. I don't know where you are, but I hope one day you'll stop running long enough to realize that family isn't what you lose. It's what you choose to keep. Claire. Ethan stared at the letter until his eyes blurred. Then quietly he folded it back and looked up. Where is she now? Mrs. Bennett hesitated, then said softly. She still lives near here, a few blocks down near the corner cafe. She takes Ben there every Saturday morning. Ethan nodded, standing. Thank you. As he stepped outside into the cold morning, the city seemed to blur around him. For 9 years, he'd been a man without direction. Now he had one. A corner cafe, a boy named Ben, and a woman whose words still carried the truth he'd been too afraid to face. He looked down at his jacket, and smiled faintly. It had led him home once. Maybe it could again. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as Ethan stepped inside. It was late morning, and the warm smell of coffee, pancakes, and cinnamon filled the air. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, painting golden stripes across the small tables where families and students sat chatting over breakfast. For a moment he stood frozen, a man out of time, staring at a life that had kept going without him. Then he saw them. Near the window, in a corner booth surrounded by the glow of sunlight, sat Claire. Her hair loosely tied back, a cup of coffee in one hand, her expression soft but tired. Across from her sat Ben, swinging his legs, his plate full of scrambled eggs and toast. He was animated, talking about something with his hands, the way children do when the world is still full of wonder. Ethan's throat tightened. Every detail hit him at once. The way Ben tilted his head when he smiled, how his eyebrows arched the same way his own did, and the quiet gentleness in the way he spoke to his mother. He wanted to walk straight over, to kneel down and tell the boy everything. That he hadn't stopped thinking about him, that he hadn't meant to vanish, that he'd carried the weight of that mistake every single day. But instead, he stood frozen by fear. He wasn't ready. He ordered a coffee and sat 2 tables behind them, hidden by the reflection of the window. His hands trembled as he stirred the cup, though he never took a sip. He couldn't stop watching them. The way Claire brushed crumbs from Ben's shirt, the way Ben smiled up at her like she was the whole world. When Ben dropped his napkin, Ethan instinctively moved to pick it up. Claire noticed first. Their eyes met. It was like time folded. Her hand froze halfway across the table, her lips parting just slightly in shock. The sunlight caught her eyes, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan saw them clearly. The same deep hazel that had once made him believe in better versions of himself. "Ethan?" she whispered, disbelief threading through her voice. He stood slowly, every muscle trembling. The cafe fell away around them. All he could hear was the quiet sound of his name on her lips, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. Ben looked between them, confused. "Mom? Who's that?" Claire's lips trembled. She set her cup down, steadying herself. "That's someone I used to know." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice low and rough. "Claire, I didn't come here to cause trouble. I saw him yesterday. He gave me this." He pulled the blue jacket from his arm and set it gently on the table. Ben's eyes widened. "Hey, that's my jacket." Claire blinked. "You still have that old thing?" Ben nodded proudly. "You said it used to belong to someone important." Ethan smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened. "It did." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that holds too many words that can't be said in public. Claire stood up slowly, glancing around the cafe. "Let's talk outside," she said quietly. They stepped onto the sidewalk, the sound of passing cars muffled by the early spring breeze. Ben stayed close to his mom, clutching her hand but staring curiously at Ethan. "You shouldn't have come," Claire said finally, her voice quiet but sharp. "You can't just appear after all this time." Ethan nodded. "I know. And I wouldn't have, except he found me first." He gestured toward Ben, his voice cracking. "He gave me this jacket last night, Claire. He didn't know who I was, but he still helped me." Her eyes softened despite herself. "That sounds like him." "He's kind," Ethan said quietly. "Like you." Claire looked away, blinking fast. "You left us, Ethan. You don't get to walk back and pretend that didn't happen." "I'm not pretending," he said. "I'm trying to fix what I broke." She turned toward him, pain flashing across her face. "You can't fix time." "No," he said softly, "but maybe I can show up for what's left of it." Ben tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, who is he?" Claire hesitated. Her lips parted, then closed again. The truth hovered there between them, fragile, dangerous, and long overdue. She knelt beside her son, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's someone who used to be very important to us." Ethan's voice trembled. "Someone who still is." Ben looked at him, his brow furrowed. "Do I know you?" Ethan crouched, meeting the boy's gaze. For the first time, he saw his own reflection in his son's eyes. "Not yet," he said softly. "But I'd like to." Ben studied him for a moment, then smiled, the kind of innocent, forgiving smile only a child can give. "You can sit with us next time." Claire blinked back tears. The boy's words were simple, but they hit harder than anything Ethan had ever heard. He nodded, voice barely steady. "I'd like that, Ben. More than anything." As the three of them stood in the sunlight, surrounded by the hum of the city, Claire finally exhaled. The wall she'd built for nearly a decade didn't collapse, but for the first time, they cracked just enough to let a little light through. The next morning, the sun rose soft and golden over the city skyline, one of those rare Chicago mornings that seemed to forgive everything that came before it. The rain had stopped, the streets still glistened, and somewhere in the quiet rhythm of passing cars, Ethan Cross found himself standing outside the same cafe once again. He had barely slept. Every moment of the night before replayed in his mind. Ben's voice, Claire's eyes, the weight of the blue jacket folded neatly beside his bed. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but he'd been given something even rarer. A chance. Inside, The cafe looked the same as it had yesterday, warm, alive, full of ordinary laughter and morning light. But this time, when the bell above the door rang, Claire didn't flinch. She looked up from the corner table, and though her expression was cautious, it wasn't closed. Ben sat beside her, coloring in a small notebook, his tongue poking out in concentration. Ethan hesitated by the door. "Is it okay if I?" Claire nodded once. "Sit." He slid into the booth across from them, the scent of fresh coffee and maple syrup filling the air. Ben looked up, smiling easily. "Hi again." Ethan smiled back. "Hey, buddy. What are you working on?" The boy turned the page around. A drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "It's us," he said proudly. "You, me, and Mom." Ethan froze, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The drawing was simple, childlike, but it was more beautiful than anything he'd ever built. Claire glanced at him, her expression softening despite herself. "He doesn't waste time," she murmured. "No," Ethan said quietly. "He gets that from you." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not heavy this time, just honest. Then Ben leaned forward, his voice curious. "Mom said you used to be friends. Were you funny back then?" Ethan chuckled softly. "I tried to be, but she never laughed at my jokes." Claire smirked. "Because they weren't funny." Ben giggled, looking between them like he was watching a secret reunion unfold. And in a way he was. They talked for an hour about school, about Claire's work, about the neighborhood. Ben showed him his drawings, asked him questions about airplanes and skyscrapers, and told him about his dream to be an engineer someday. Ethan listened intently, every word sinking deeper than he could explain. When Ben ran up to the counter to grab another napkin, Claire finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of years. "I don't know what you expect, Ethan. I can't just pretend the past didn't happen." He nodded slowly. "I don't expect that. I just want to earn a place in the present." She sighed. "You hurt us, but I can see you're different now." He met her gaze. "I had to lose everything to realize what really mattered." She studied him for a long time, searching his face for the man she once knew. And though time had aged him, there it was. The same sincerity, the same quiet strength that used to make her believe in him. Finally, she nodded. "Ben doesn't need a hero, Ethan. He just needs someone who stays." "I can do that," he said. "I'm done running." Just then, Ben returned, holding a tiny pancake on a fork. "You didn't eat, Dad." The word hit both adults at once. Simple, innocent, unplanned. Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't correct him. She just looked at Ethan, and saw him swallow hard, his eyes wet with something too big for words. He smiled shakily. "Thanks, buddy." Ben slid into the booth between them, resting his small head on Ethan's arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the city roared on, horns, buses, life. But inside that cafe, time slowed to something quiet and new. After breakfast, Claire gathered her things. "We have to go. Ben's got school." Ethan stood with them, unsure what to say, afraid of saying too much. But before he could speak, Claire looked at him and said softly, "We come here every Saturday. Same table." It wasn't an invitation. It was a bridge. Ethan nodded, his voice thick. "I'll be here." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe this time, you'll keep your promise." As they walked away, Ben turned at the door and waved. "Bye, Dad." The word carried through the air like a second sunrise. Fragile, bright, and full of forgiveness. Ethan stood there long after they'd gone, his reflection in the cafe window layered over the city skyline. A man who had once lost everything, now holding something infinitely more precious. a beginning. He reached into his pocket and unfolded Ben's drawing, tracing the 3 stick figures with his thumb. For the first time in 10 years, he felt whole. And as the light poured through the window, catching on the blue jacket slung over his chair, Ethan Cross finally understood. The jacket wasn't a memory of what he'd lost. It was proof of what had always been waiting for him to return.